about how much better you look because that just really backfired on me last time. We're live.
Like all I heard is I'm pretty. Like that was all I heard.
It was just.
Hi everybody, welcome to our March 23rd weird edition of COVID Convos. I guess I'm kind of moderating this tonight. I don't know. Well, maybe Maggie will show up. Maggie is doing family things. So for those of you who don't know me, I am Levi. Oh, I hate introducing myself. From the Sunshine House, and that's kind of what I do. And I'm joined right now, and maybe later by other folks, but right now we're with Karen and Marsha. So Karen, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us about you and what's going on, and I don't know.
Okay, my name's Karen Sharma, and I'm the acting exec. During the day, I run our Human Rights Commission in the province, and I do some other things. I chair the board of the Women's Health Clinic, and I also do some organizing with QPOC Winnipeg. And I'm a first generation South Asian. Great news today. Well, two very good things. One very not great thing happened to me this morning. And then two very good things happened to me later in the day. One, I found out that my mom has her appointment for a vaccine, which is really exciting, booked for April 18th. So we're all pretty excited for her because she retired at the start of the pandemic. So the pandemic's been like rough on her. And the other thing is I just came home actually because I was delivering a guest lecture in a class, and in the chat function, someone just wrote, "You're a queen. You are you're a queen." And I don't know if it was directed at me, but I'm taking it. So those are two good things today.
You are a queen, always. And then we also got Marsha. Marsha, who are you? What's going on in your world?
Hey everyone, I'm Marsha Anderson. I'm Korean Anishinaabe. I grew up in Winnipeg. My roots go to Peguis and Norway House. And I'm a public health doctor. And I'm also a mom of two kids, and they did not clean their room today. They were supposed to, which is why I was shaking my head just before we started, because I had to clean up the room before we started. It's a whole thing. Then my dad opened the door to ask me about the laptop and let the dog in because I also have a puppy and a Labradoodle, and it's a chaotic full house.
Great. We are really missing Maggie's energy. You had lots of excitement with your kids though in the last couple of weeks, and you've been busy, and life has been really busy for you. So why don't you just go into the whole spiel and tell us what's going on in COVID world for those of us who have been voluntarily out of the loop?
Yes, sometimes that's a nice place to be, actually, because, with the pandemic having been here for more than a year, certainly also really feeling my life is only mom life and COVID, and the way those two things overtwine, and ready for some different aspects of life. Nonetheless, what's going on with COVID? There were 98 new cases announced today. So in total, over 33,000 cases. The average number of new cases has been trending back up over the past week or two. The test positivity rate is back up over 5%. It's at 5.3% today. There are 142 people in hospital in total, which again is back up some, 63 of them with active or infectious COVID-19. And a total of 25 people in the ICU. But again, 11 are considered active, which basically means they're in that 10-day infectious period for COVID-19. A lot of the province's numbers over the past couple months have been driven by what's been going on in First Nation communities. And again, we've talked about this a lot. This is due to the impacts of racism and colonization, in particular, how that impacts the environment. So the housing conditions, food security, income insecurity, how the impacts of chronic racism, trauma, colonization, in fact, impact underlying health conditions. So for First Nations, new cases have been consistently making up around 40%. I just realized I have the wrong report open because that's how my day is going. And 40 to 50% of people in the hospital and in the ICU, but I'm not going to try to recall what those numbers are. I think some of the good stuff that's been going on that we've really been celebrating from a First Nations perspective is how many people have been vaccinated. So just to share a bit of the good news, as of last Thursday, we had delivered almost 10,500 doses of Moderna, almost 2,800 doses of Pfizer, and 75 doses of AstraZeneca to First Nations people. So feeling really good about that rollout. And then our mass vaccine rollout has started in communities this week, where we have this goal and actually a plan to get 100,000 doses in people between now and June. That includes first and second doses, and working really hard still with the province, not just for our off-reserve First Nations relatives, but for other BIPOC groups that are experiencing disproportionate impacts of COVID-19 and ensuring that they have equitable access to the vaccine as well.
Wow, it's like you talk about this all the time. You got it down pat. What are like, again, because like I've been only paying attention to like the very minimal kind of information about this, and I've been kind of stuck in my own bubble for a long time. For like at least 4 weeks, I've been more busy than previously. So what are like some of the challenges that we're facing, and like I don't actually know a lot about like the challenges that people are facing in terms of doing the rollout, because I know of like things that we're facing internally over at Sunshine House, but like has there been any kind of major hurdles that you've had to overcome or in this rollout?
Yeah, I would say there are a lot of hurdles. And it starts with how we develop the relationships and how we get access to the vaccine, right? And I would say, again, one of the things I would celebrate over the past year has been the leadership through the Manitoba First Nation Pandemic Response Coordination Team in getting First Nation specific data, in the leadership that we've had in deploying rapid response teams, the way we've built relationships with senior government officials within, Shared Health, Manitoba Health, FNIB, so that we did have access, I would say, to discussions around the allocation of vaccine very early on. Not right from the beginning, and quite frankly, not right across the board. We have a specific table to discuss First Nations vaccine issues, but not how that fits into the broader rollout, and that still is a challenge, actually, because it's like you have all these central tables and then you have a First Nations table. And so when they're talking about things like, for example, the medical priority conditions for AstraZeneca, or how they're going to roll that out to physicians and pharmacists, we're not participating in those discussions. And those are important discussions where there should be experts from different disproportionately impacted communities, not just First Nations, but other BIPOC communities as well, because it matters from a medical and public health perspective, and it matters from a community expertise and community relationship perspective. And so it's been challenging to try to have access to those decision-making tables and that transparent flow of information around those other parts of it. And since I have roles in urban Indigenous health as well, and with the race, ethnicity, Indigenous identifier data and the BIPOC working group, I kind of see it from all of those different perspectives. With the on-reserve rollout, some of the challenges that you might be aware of when you're delivering any service on reserve. So we're talking about 63 different First Nation communities in Manitoba. Probably the closest one is about half an hour outside the perimeter, and the farthest ones are remote, isolated, no year-round road access, where the airport's across water from the community. So we're talking about multiple transfers during breakup season that we're heading into now. The winter roads are closed again. As it thaws, we're talking about muddy roads, not paved roads that we're trying to transport very fragile vaccines over. So it's planning all the logistics for that and trying to vaccinate anywhere from hundreds to thousands of people in the matter of days because of the extra surge support that's needed. So, and then within the city, we would think about people who have very good reasons to mistrust the system. So longstanding experiences of racism and other forms of discrimination, why people don't necessarily trust the information that they hear or trust that they'll be treated fairly or respectfully if they go in to encounter the healthcare system. People who don't have identification, which is something that we've talked about before, and how you ensure folks can still access the vaccine and access it at the time when the evidence shows they should have access to it because of the higher risk that they experience. So those have been and are some of the ongoing challenges that we're working through.
Thanks for entertaining my question. I like Karen's glasses, and then every time I look at Karen, I'm like, "You're a queen." But we actually have a question from the audience, yay! Because I think people can understand that I'm really struggling hosting this, so I'm really trying my best. I'm very exhausted. But Theo asked if the government has said anything about Métis and Inuit people living in Manitoba about, I assume, vaccination access. If there's any differences, or not differences, if there's any kind of plans regarding those specific populations.
Yeah, I am aware that there's been engagement around particularly the urban Indigenous planning with MMF and Manitoba Inuit Association, and that in the media briefings several times, what they've said is that if a community were able to show evidence of disproportionate impacts, then applying the same age differential that's applied for First Nations would be considered. So those would be the things that I would say government has said that I have noticed, and I don't know if either of you have anything to add.
So it would be up to like their representative organizations. So like, just for clarification, so like it would be up to MMF and it would be up to MIA, I guess, to kind of bring that data forward. How would they get access to that data? That's because that's very, it's not really.
There are ways to do it. And actually, since we started collecting self-identified data early on in the pandemic, Métis and Inuit identifiers were included in that. I'm not as familiar with Manitoba Inuit Association and if they also have membership lists of Inuit people living in Manitoba. Certainly Métis MMF also has a citizenship or nationhood list that could be used for linkage analysis the same way that we do with the Indian Status Registry. And so it would be using one of those mechanisms in a relationship, like we have an information sharing agreement that's a legally binding agreement between First Nations Health and Social Secretariat on behalf of First Nations people in Manitoba and Manitoba Health Seniors and Active Living, which is where the public health data is held. So the possibility to create the data is there. And I can't speak to any of the bilateral discussions that have happened between either of those organizations and government on signing agreement or producing those reports.
You're like really good at your job, hey? Pretty impressive.
Thank you.
Karen, do you got anything?
Well, just speaking of how good Marcia is at her job, I think one of the things that's been so successful is just like the communication strategy and a lot of around First Nations vaccination and the work I think you've been doing both personally and then collectively through your task force to really communicate eligibility and also like impacts and risks. And you modeled that personally by telling us about your vaccination experience. But I think it's just so important that BIPOC communities hear directly from our people about vaccination and all the sides of it, right? Because there's a real natural and understandable vaccine hesitancy in a lot of our communities. And the way I think to address that is information that's grounded in our experience and from our people who understand the risks and the challenges associated with being the first to access something new. and how that's harmed us, harmed people's in the past. So I just appreciate the very careful and considered way. And I think, I don't know, I don't know if it's empowered, but it's a way that respects people's agency and lived experience and knowledge, as opposed to sort of top down approach to communicating about vaccine.
Well, I think what was important to me and with the people that I work with is that, of course we had our baseline relationships that we were working from. It wasn't like I came from nowhere and suddenly started trying to tell people what to do when it came to COVID. I've been part of the community and practicing public health in Indigenous health contexts for more than a decade now, right? And then I'm part of ceremonial communities beyond just my family communities and, out at different cultural events and things like that. So those connections are already there. My vested interest is with community. And then we've been doing this work for a year in that First Nations centered way. And so I think when we are approaching communications around vaccine, that's the model we need to follow. We don't want the first time we're engaging with any community to be, and here's what you should do because we're the experts and we're telling you should do it, right? Like we've emphasized so many times, that trusted information from trusted people whose loyalty and accountability is to the community, I think is really important when we're sharing information about something that is scary to a lot of people.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct. One of the most interesting things that I've seen come out of the at the federal level was they have a call out to different community organizations. I don't even think you need to be a registered charity. I think you can just be like a collective of people, and it's like a grant available to figure out how you can disperse information about vaccines and at the community level. So it's not like, as you said, that kind of typical top-down approach is like they're giving money to different people to build kind of momentum around vaccinations. Mm-hmm. So I think that's really cool. And I think one of the things I was just reading earlier that I think one of the concerns is, I don't know, but like in the United States right now, they have lots of doses that are available to be taken, but in some places they don't have enough people who are willing to take them. So I think that, I don't know if we'll run into those same kind of problems, but I think that's an interesting kind of thing I never thought of because, I don't know, I've always just kind of been vaccinated. And so that's always been my baseline is like, when the vaccine comes, I'm really excited for it. And that's one of the hesitancies that we're seeing too at Sunshine House is like, we're talking about getting people, like now we have a lot of folks who are eligible. And so a lot of people are like, well, are you going to get vaccinated? And we have those conversations. Like, yes, I am going to get vaccinated because I trust the science. I trust the people who have put a lot of work into this. And even though I don't necessarily trust bodies like arms of the state that approve these things, I just feel like there's enough science and evidence behind it that it's worth it. And I've been vaccinated with other things before, and what's the harm in trying something new, right? Mm-hmm. But I know that a lot of we have several people who had not very positive experiences with the H1N1 vaccination, and so a lot of people are coming back to that when that happened. It was like, well, that was a terrible time. I got really, really sick, and so I was like, well, this is going to be different, but I don't know, right?
Well, and I think it's important to talk about what that means if you get sick after a vaccine, actually. So, there's just a few things I want to mention. I think there is a potential downside to talking about vaccine hesitancy too much because we start to send the message that you should be hesitant, and we actually are seeing very good uptake so far. in communities and in people in urban areas who have access to the vaccine. And we're seeing very few serious adverse reactions. So very few serious allergic reactions, certainly side effects, but very few serious side effects. So it is a very safe vaccine overall. Now, part of the reason that I missed the last episode was because I had had my second dose of Moderna the day before, and I had terrible side effects from it. And this might be what some of the folks who had the H1N1 vaccine experienced. And I'll just say, H1N1, there is also a lot of talk about vaccine hesitancy, and particularly in First Nations communities, uptake was excellent, okay? Because people made very informed choices about the risks and the benefits when we saw what was happening in our communities from H1N1. But the side effects that I had a swollen arm. It was about 12 centimeters across, the big red swollen area around where I had the injection. This is after my second dose. I had fevers, chills, fatigues. I actually woke up in the morning, I was sore. And my first thought was, what workout did I do yesterday? But I hadn't worked out. It was just the sore muscles from the vaccine. And that did last for 2 or 3 days, probably 4 days before I was totally back to normal. And not gonna lie, they were the most significant side effects I'd ever had from a vaccine. But for one thing, because I've read all the trials and the evidence, I was kind of expecting it. The side effects tend to be worse in younger people, and that's because we get a more robust immune system reaction to the vaccine. So it really sucks for a few days, but the reason that it sucks is because your body is working so hard at reacting to the vaccine and producing that reaction that includes antibodies and T cells and other components of the immune system, so that if you're exposed to COVID-19 in the future, you're much less likely to get sick. So, you know, in the balance of things, I would still say if I had the opportunity to get vaccinated again, or when the evidence evolves and we find out more about booster shots, I'll get the booster shots too, because those side effects were bad. They were manageable. They're gone now. And I know that I have somewhere in the neighborhood of 90 to 94% protection against symptomatic or severe COVID-19. And when I think about my personal risks as a First Nations woman, I'm 43 years old, relatively healthy, but I actually do have asthma. If I got COVID-19, I'd be at pretty high risk for a severe disease from it. And I live in a house with 5 other people. So when I think about spreading it on to the people around me, and my parents help with my kids a lot, I want to reduce that exposure for all of us. And so those benefits to me made it worth the risk of side effects, and I got all of them. So
sorry, now I want to go back to the vaccine question. Are the side effects generally, the potential side effects generally worse after the second shot?
Yeah, they are, because they're due to your immune response, and you already have some immune response after the first dose. So the side effects do tend to be worse after the second dose. It's kind of like, I don't know if last time you had a tetanus shot, but sometimes when you get those booster shots, whether it's something like tetanus or the flu vaccine, you can get a sore arm from it. It's the same type of reaction, was just like that, but more extreme.
I think the last time I got my Twinrex booster, I got pretty ill after that one. That one was weird, because I never ever had reaction to any of the Twinrexes that I had taken, but then that one was like pretty bad. But that's a personal anecdote. Karen, you got anything?
No, thanks for that, Marcia. I hadn't really thought about the implications of talking about hesitancy, but I can see that it might actually draw upon stereotypes, or like not reflect that our communities do uptake certain kinds of public health approaches at higher rates than other communities. And so it might actually, I could see that it might actually have negative implications to talk about things in ways, or to cement what actually might just be stereotypes or impressionistic assumptions about BIPOC communities, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sometimes it's not so much about the hesitance as having equitable, trusted information through appropriate mechanisms and messengers, right? And it's kind of the equivalent of planning for BIPOC communities, what government does for mainstream population, quote unquote.
Yeah, and speaking about like equitable kind of communication and then also equitable access approaches, like we've sort of, maybe it was before we started filming, but we were talking about challenges around like gaining access to vaccine via super sites, right? As opposed to community approaches that bring vaccine to community, or the challenges of just what you need in order to access vaccination, like identification and other things that people might not have easy access to. And so, yeah, I think that it is in the careful consideration of approaches around communication and access that we get to equitable results, and maybe not cementing those other ideas.
Yeah, I think that even like when we've done our flu shot, when we did our last flu shot clinic at Sunshine House, we like people were really like participated at a very, very high rates. And some of them even went and got their flu shot twice for some reason, but that's their own prerogative. So anyway, so I don't actually imagine it's going to be a challenge. The challenge that we're facing right now is that people don't have access to the technology to book the appointments, and then people don't have ID, right? So we're trying to, and then like also because people's lives are really busy, you have to be like, would you like some reminders or some assistance getting to the thing? So those are the types of things that we're working out over there. Is like, okay, well, we can create like a separate calendar for like clients who might be going to get vaccinated, and then just kind of when we see them that week, it's like, okay, how's your plan? How are you going to go down there? What are you going to do after, and sort of thing. So like working out those types of things. And like we're fortunate because we're a smaller organization that we can provide that kind of assistance. For the time being, and there might be newer, like as we see, because I know that behind the scenes there's a lot of different plans for vaccine rollout and stuff, so things could change, particularly for the folks that we work with. So it's kind of, I think the last time we talked it was an exciting time, but it's still, I think Adrian summed it up really well at the end, is like there's still there's lots of things to be excited for about this, but there's also still a lot of hesitancy but around like how are we gonna get kind of everyone who qualifies, get them in to get their shots and stuff like that. So I think, yeah, my brain is literally gone. Like I have no brain right now. So, but before we were talking, like also this isn't good because all three of us are introverts, and we get paid to be extroverts. Like that's it. So this is terrible.
Like we literally shut off our extrovertedness at like 5:30 p.m. We're just like, nope. Now we talk to no one. Just like go back and
seriously, I'm like, okay, it's past 7 and I have to like communicate with human beings. This is gonna be difficult. But if anyone is watching, like, feel free to ask us a question. But before we went on air, we were talking about the International Day of Elimination of Discrimination that had just passed on Sunday, and we were kind of talking about like, even though COVID is happening and like we're in the middle of a pandemic, but much like around this time last year, there's a lot of real world things that are happening that are impacting our communities in very different ways. And I generally don't pay attention to these like big gesture days. But Marcia, you had mentioned that it might be something that we will want to talk about. You had some feelings about it, and Karen, I'm sure you have lots of great things to add. So that's kind of my really awkward, bumpy segue. Yeah. Let's do it.
You said the word feelings. I'm comfortable talking about thoughts and facts.
Good, because that's my route too. So like, go for it. Thoughts,
yeah. So again, I forget the exact title because it's kind of late and my brain is tired as well. But it is the International Day for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, I believe, is the official title. And, you know, as a visibly First Nations person who's been working in large mainstream organizations for a long time, but especially through the course of the pandemic, I've had a lot of opportunity to reflect on how multiple levels of racism positioned us for the way we would see COVID-19 impact BIPOC communities, to watch the discussions around that in media and within decision-making circles, to listen to what does get discussed and what doesn't get discussed, to observe who gets invited to leadership roles and decision-making tables and who doesn't, and to see how that translates into the public health response broadly across the country and internationally. And I was mentioning, and Karen and I have discussed this before as well, very early in the pandemic last year, we'd had that cluster of 3 officer-involved shootings of Indigenous people in Winnipeg, and a lot of racialized police violence. All of us would be familiar with that. The civilian oversight report into how the RCMP handled Colton Boushie's death was just released, which unsurprisingly to anybody was completely mishandled, and found that they did racially discriminate against his family in multiple ways. Also explicitly mentioned the fact that they left the vehicle uncovered, which destroyed significant evidence that likely impacted the trial outcome, and was again reflecting on how, of the different forms of racism in the justice system, the lack of equal protection under the law is one of the ways that racism expresses itself. And we often talk about over-incarceration and the myriad forms of racism that lead to over-incarceration, but it also is the under-protection. And of course, those 2 factors are interrelated within the system. And so the work that I've been doing over this past year, as with my career, is never outside of those systems. And it's exhausting. And I was reflecting a little bit on how, for BIPOC folks, there's never theoretical work. There's never anti-racism in theory or EDI in theory, because every conversation I have, every report I read, every meeting that I go to is either explicitly or through its silence upholding and recreating those systems that are creating these health gaps, or unfortunately less commonly contributing to disrupting those systems and trying to mitigate those impacts. So those were some of the reflections that I've been having around race and racism and the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. And this work isn't theoretical, and it's not, it's not in concept or conceptual, because we think about the people we love and the implications that these policy decisions have in real time for our communities. And so we don't get the benefit of talking, about would this improve things for BIPOC communities, or what could the implications be? Because most of the time when we're coming to doing racial justice work, it's with a sense of urgency. And so, those comments are so well taken. And I've also been thinking about the fact that this International Day, which is tied to the Universal Declaration on the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination, to which Canada is a signatory. It happened in the midst of these really acute incidents of anti-Asian racism over the past week and a bit. And just it felt like this really tragic and awful book ending of the pandemic, right? We're 1 year since the start of the pandemic, and this is sort of what marked the beginning of the pandemic, and here we are 1 year later, and we are still talking about anti-Asian hate, and we're still talking about police violence against BIPOC communities. And it just feels like this really tragic, unending cycle. So that it kind of hit me hard this weekend for sure.
I think what I found really fascinating, I think I like a lot of the times, I appreciate what both of you have said, but I think a lot of the times for me, I get because I'm white passing, I often get privy to a lot of, and because I have pretty close connections with a lot of people who don't often share my beliefs about things. And a lot of times that manifests itself in overt racism or in like other forms of discrimination. But I think one of the things that always strikes me is that Canadians in general like to there seems to be a sense of pride around we're better than those people to the south. And I was on my way to the last kind of gig for the Gorge Festival this weekend, and I was listening to CBC, and they were talking about how in Canada, actually per capita, there's been more incidences of anti-Asian crimes than in the United States. And they were using, and then there was somebody they were talking about in Vancouver and how it's like it's increased in just such crazy numbers. And I always think about that too, especially in regards to my own community, like First Nations communities, and how if people actually listened to the facts and the thoughts of the people actually impacted by these things, they would see that it would also show that we have that there's a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done. And one of the things that I liked the lawyer in the Colton Bushy that was part of the Colton Bushy that was representing the Bushy family. And one of the things she said today on CBC that I kind of got a glimpse of is she was like, and media companies need to take responsibility for the amount of anti-Indigenous comments that are happening in their comments and allowing it. And that needs to be treated in a very different way than how it's currently being treated. And I was like, you're right, because there's a reason that we say we don't read the comments. Like, don't ever read the comments. And it's like, and it's not only is it detrimental to the people impacted, but it has such a significant impact on anyone who ventures into those comments, whether they're Indigenous or non-Indigenous. Because if you're non-Indigenous, it knows that it's actually okay for you to vocalize these types of feelings, and there's actually going to be no repercussions for you. And then for Indigenous peoples, it just reiterates what many of us already feel, and that we are seen as less than by so many people in this country or in this territory that we call Canada.
Yeah, I think, I've never personally understood that myth about Canadians being less racist, or there being less racism in Canada, or that it's nicer somehow, or it's not as bad. Because by all objective evidence going back decades and decades, it's been explicit. It has been malevolent. It's not been well-intentioned, benign racism from people who knew better. I think, one thing social media probably does is put that into more of a stark relief. So it becomes harder for people to continue promoting that myth. It was pretty devastating to read about the recent situation in Quebec where those nurses were fired, thankfully, but the reason they were fired was because they were taunting a First Nations woman and telling her they were going to call her Joyce. So that we have systems operating to the point where people would feel enabled to do that without fear of repercussions. Like that doesn't happen out of nowhere from beneficent, non-maleficent, non-racists, right?
No, I agree completely, and I also like I've never understood the myth, and I think you alluded to it in that that we try to think of it as being more gentle in Canada or like less harmful or less impactful. I remember my cousin she was present in the courtrooms in that recent the name is escaping me now, but in Thunder Bay, the person who was hit by the trailer hitch and then she died, and so she was present during that whole trial, and she was kind of she was texting me and she was giving updates about what was happening, and like some people who were sitting here were like aghast, but by and large we were all like, no, this is not abnormal behavior by the police. This is not abnormal behavior by how lawyers represent people who commit violent acts against Indigenous people. Like this, none of this is actually surprising, and it shouldn't be, because we've been telling you this for a long time. Karen, you look like you had something to say before I interjected.
No, but exactly, BIPOC folks have been saying it for a long time. And then like coming back to what Marcia was saying earlier, which is, you're not invited to the tables. And when you are invited to the tables, what other people are framing as theoretical conversations around equity and diversity, are about life and death, right? And then that gets used against you because you're framed as the like non-objective or advocate, like advocate, like employee or whatever. And so it's just this like it's this bind, right? Like, you can't advocate for your justice and you can't continue on in these circumstances. Sometimes it feels from within these systems.
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, her name was Barbara Kentner. I just wanted to look that up. I knew it was Barbara, but it was Barbara Kentner, the woman who was killed that way. I was reflecting earlier today because of some conversations I've had recently and throughout the course of my career on how that sentence, "she's such a strong advocate," has a very different tone and implication depending on where it's uttered, right? Like in community, that's something that's really celebrated, not always in large mainstream organizations. And I was reflecting on the difference between work that's considered planning and work that's considered advocacy predominantly has to do with positionality, right? Same evidence base, same data, same theoretical foundations, but the positionality in terms of at the table, trying to get to the table, and how in line with the status quo, a departure from the status quo. Those are probably the main differences, I would say, in whether work is considered planning or advocacy within systems.
Yeah, and then this really strange assumption, even though you're doing evidence-based work, that you have inherent bias. And it's also this like weird framing of objectivity and who gets to speak, and who can do work that's grounded in good policy, good evidence, etc. But yeah, I just think all of that is like, sometimes I just want to, I just think, you're kind of damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, in a way. But that comes back to my whole like, oh my gosh, this particular International Day at this time, and feeling it like it's a bit much, but so I'm in a particular mood. But.
Well, and part of the reason I wanted to talk about this today is these are experiences that a lot of BIPOC folks are having right now. who don't always have spaces to debrief them in. And, you know, one of the reflections, I haven't been doing a lot of talks lately, whereas normally, like, that's something that's shifted for me during the pandemic due to timing and my like personal energy and things like that. But my favorite feedback after a talk is when BIPOC folks come up and talk about how they felt seen or felt validated or heard something that was common to their experience too, because of how rarely that happens in the academy, right? And so I was thinking about that over the weekend, and as Sunday passed, and of the conversations that I've had with other BIPOC folks doing this work through the course of the pandemic, and how important sometimes having these conversations can be in terms of that solidarity and feeling seen and heard when we've been mostly immersed in systems in which it's made clear to us we don't belong.
Yeah, and the triple track of work that you constantly have to be doing, right? To show up, and you have to show up at 150% all of the time because you can't have any like time off, you know, to like half-ass it or whatever. Like, you got to show up at 150% all of the time, and then the emotional work it takes to debrief being in those spaces and doing that work so that you can recuperate enough to do that work again tomorrow. And yeah, I think the pandemic is exacerbating so much, but it's also exacerbating the labor it's taking to advocate, I use that word, like understanding the implications of it, but advocate for an equity-based lens and for justice in communities.
I agree, and I think the other thing that the pandemic has exacerbated, and it's obvious though, is that we haven't been able to physically gather, and we haven't been able to do knowledge transfer and knowledge acquisition and talk about these things in the same way. So like Marsha was talking about, like talks, there's things like the small things are super crucial to like learning how to operate and how to support yourself within communities. So like getting ready together to get ready to go to ladies' night, or like planning or getting together pre-partying and all those things, or like like stuff that happens around kitchen tables and all of those things, all of those like super sacred moments of learning and teaching and like knowledge transfer, those aren't happening, and it's really difficult to even kind of simulate those in this type of environment. And I feel like that's also been part of the reason why I find that my energy for all the things that I used to love just like waxes and wanes, but like when it's up, but when it's down, it is so down. And now I don't even know if being up is actually what I was capable of before, if that makes any sense. Like, I feel like I'm like the highest I can get is about 70% of what I was able to do before. And so I find that as these, and we had talked about these kinds of impacts, or like this has been a common thread through these conversations, but it's like, I am starting to have feelings and I am really starting to miss all of those things. Like, and it's been really hard. So I don't really know what my point is, but I think that's one of the other things that, when we're talking about like combating and coming up with strategies as a community to deal with racial discrimination and other forms of discrimination, like that we're really missing.
I'm just going to mark my calendar. March 23rd is the day Levi started having feelings. So I just feel like we should mark that and make note of it somehow.
That's a very nice calendar.
March 23rd, 2021.
I'm going to give you a hug now.
Oh, yeah.
Hugs.
That is also the way that Levi and I decided that we're hugging from now on. COVID safe.
COVID safe. Does anyone else have anything they want to add to this topic? Or to any of the things that we had talked about this evening? Any questions?
So my battery's about to die. Apologies for not being responsible and bringing my charger in.
No, I love that. I think that's a great way to end. There's not a lot happening in the comment section. We had a very fruitful and engaging conversation. I'm gonna walk away and I'm gonna take some things with me and think about things that are intellectually stimulating, and then I'll send you like midnight texts asking you all these questions like I typically do when I start thinking about things and feelings. Also, I don't ever think that you're allowed to say that you were irresponsible. You're like the most responsible person I know.
If anything, like you ensured you had enough battery power for a 15-minute COVID combos. It's just the epitome of prior planning.
It is.
All right, folks. Well,
I think this is good. Yeah. Oh, bye, Marsha. Okay, Karen, we really got to sign out because nobody wants to look at us in silence.
Yeah, exactly. Marsha was like the kind of front.
So like huge props to Jude who was handling the back end for us, and also this week we'll have a special COVID combos on Thursday. That'll be with the Manitoba Harm Reduction Network and Uzoma and Dawn Levand and a whole bunch of a couple of other folks, and they're going to be talking about like safer consumption sites and all of the buzz around that. So that's going to be pretty exciting.
Those special harm reduction focused COVID combos are so good. Like
so good.
I like shared them with staff at my workplace to be like, we should watch this as training for how to do our work, because they're such great nuggets of information on how to really embody a harm reduction approach. So check that out.
Yeah, and I also I love them because they're very real and they have a very diverse, like this COVID combo is very real and very fun, but we're also like very similar, right? Like we're all pretty we're a tight family. But those ones are good because they bring in a lot of different voices that we don't amplify enough.
Yeah, amazing.
Oh, Linda says thank you for all of these. You're welcome.
Oh, thanks, Linda.
Okay, but this is it for us now. Do you have anything else you want to add? Any exciting things happening now?
Just that I really miss everybody. And I feel like I've barely been able to go on social media and stuff because I like you were saying, just the level of depletion that I think we're all feeling. But I just want to say that I miss everybody, and I miss you, Levi.
I miss you too, Karen. Hugs. Thanks, Jude. Cut us off now, please.